Let's get right into it. Number 12. In the 1950s, something strange was happening in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. People were dying from laughter. It didn't start funny. It started with tremors, muscles twitching, eyes darting. Then came the giggles, strange, involuntary, horrifying. Victims would burst into fits of uncontrollable laughter, not joy, but something dark, broken. They'd stumble, shake, then collapse, and within months they were gone. The locals called it kuru, which literally means to tremble with fear. To the villagers, it was a spiritual curse. But to scientists, it was something new, something terrifying. The source? Endocannibalism. These tribes honored their dead by eating their flesh, especially the brain. A sacred, loving ritual. But inside those brains were prion, twisted proteins with one mission: destroy everything. Unlike viruses or bacteria, prion don't invade. They corrupt from within, turning your healthy brain cells into ticking time bombs. Once the infection starts, there's no cure. Just a slow descent into madness. To test this theory, scientists conducted an ethically nightmarish experiment. They injected brain tissue from kuru victims into chimpanzees, and waited. It worked. The chimps began to tremble, then laugh, then die. The horrifying part? This took years to show symptoms. Kuru could live dormant inside you, slowly chewing through your nervous system without a sound. Whole villages were wiped out before anyone understood what was happening. The experiment confirmed what science feared. Love, ritual, tradition, can be deadly when biology doesn't cooperate. They died honoring their ancestors, and their ancestors took them with them. Number 11. Imagine being born and never touched. No lullabies, no eye contact, no warmth, just cold hands, metal cribs, and silence. That's exactly what happened in the 1940s at a hospital in the United States. Researchers wanted to understand what infants really needed to survive, so they built a ward where babies were stripped of affection. Nurses were ordered not to smile, not to speak, only feed, clean, and leave. It was a sterile prison for newborns. And what happened next was horrifying. At first, the babies cried, loudly, constantly, begging, in the only way they knew how, for comfort. Then came the silence. The babies stopped crying, then stopped moving, then stopped living. They began to deteriorate, not from illness, but from neglect. They lost weight. Their immune systems collapsed. Their eyes grew hollow. Some simply gave up, refusing to eat even when fed. This wasn't a disease. It was what we now call hospitalism, a clinical term for emotional starvation. Doctors had discovered something chilling. Humans need love like they need oxygen. Without physical contact, emotional exchange, or even visual recognition, the brain simply folds in on itself. Later studies showed their cortisol, stress hormone, levels were off the charts. Their brains showed stunted development. Even survivors struggled with learning, socializing, and bonding for life. These weren't babies with medical issues. They were babies with no one. The experiment was supposed to test resilience. Instead, it revealed our most terrifying weakness. Without connection, we break. And these infants were broken before they even had a chance to begin. Number 10. University of Iowa. A speech pathologist named Wendell Johnson had a theory. Maybe stuttering wasn't genetic. Maybe it was taught. So he and his assistant Mary Tudor designed an experiment. And what they did next would earn it the name, the Monster Study. They took 22 orphans from an Iowa children's home, split them into two groups. Group A was praised, supported, and encouraged to speak freely. Group B? They were told their speech was wrong. That they stuttered, even when they didn't. That they needed to stop talking so much. That people were laughing at them. These were normal-speaking children, and they were gaslit until they broke. One child, a young girl who had spoken perfectly, suddenly couldn't complete a sentence. Another began whispering, afraid of being wrong. Some stopped speaking altogether. For days, weeks, even years. And the worst part? They were never told it was an experiment, never deprogrammed, never healed. The study wasn't published for decades, buried out of shame, but the scars lasted far longer than the data. Words didn't just hurt them. Words rewired their brains. And that's the part science forgot. The tongue is sharp, and when backed by authority, it cuts deeper than a scalpel. Number 9. If you think Nazi experiments were the worst in history, you haven't heard of Unit 731. Hidden deep in Manchuria, China, during the 1930s and 40s, Japan built a secret complex where horror wore a lab coat. It was a biological weapons facility, but the real research was done on humans. Prisoners, men, women, children, were called logs, because they were used, burned, and discarded like firewood. Victims were infected with plague, syphilis, and anthrax, vivisected while alive, with no anesthesia, forced to endure frostbite tests, limbs frozen, smashed, then amputated, locked in gas chambers to study chemical warfare, injected with animal blood, gasoline, even horse urine, to see what would happen. Pregnant women were raped by guards, then dissected to observe fetal infection. Children were tied to stretchers and infected, to test transmission rates. Even the guards admitted it. This wasn't medicine, this was madness. One experiment removed a man's stomach and connected his esophagus directly to his intestines, just to see how long he'd live. Spoiler, not long. And when the war ended, the United States, desperate for data on biological warfare, struck a deal. The scientists were granted immunity, in exchange for their findings. No war crimes trial, No punishment, just files. And silence. Unit 731 didn't just kill people. It erased their dignity. Their names were never recorded. But their suffering is now written in history's darkest margins. Number 8. You're in a room. A man in a white lab coat tells you to press a button. Each time you press it, the person in the next room screams. You can't see him, only hear the pain. Please stop. I can't take this. Then silence. The man in the coat says, you must continue. Do you? Stanley Milgram asked this question in 1961. And America answered. Volunteers were told they were helping with a memory experiment. The learner was strapped to an electric chair. The teacher, the real subject, was told to shock him for every wrong answer. 15 volts, 75 volts, 150, 300, eventually, 450 volts. At that level, the machine was labeled. Danger, severe shock. The screams were recorded. But the volunteers didn't know that. They thought they were killing someone. And yet, 65% of them went all the way. Why? Because someone in authority told them to. No one forced them. No gun to the head. Just pressure. And a coat that said, science. Milgram's conclusion? Most people aren't monsters. But given the right situation, they'll become one. Not because they want to. Because they believe someone else is responsible. And that's the scariest part. You don't need evil to do evil. You just need obedience. Number 7. From the 1950s to the 70s, homosexuality was listed as a mental illness. And doctors were determined to fix, with wires, with chemicals, with fear. Men were strapped to chairs, electrodes attached to their bodies. They were shown homoerotic images, then shocked. Again, and again, and again. Others were given emetics, powerful nausea drugs, then shown pictures, then made to vomit. Sometimes they were forced to wear gas masks to trap the smell, intensifying the disgust. This wasn't fringe medicine. This was standard procedure, in military hospitals, public clinics, even university labs. It was called aversion therapy, but it wasn't therapy. It was torture wearing a stethoscope. Some men were chemically castrated, others sterilized without consent. Some underwent lobotomies, the final, brutal, cure. The idea? Break the brain's association between love and pleasure. The result? Broken people, PTSD, depression, suicide. And still, it didn't make anyone straight. It only made them afraid to be seen. The real sickness wasn't inside them. It was in the institutions that treated identity like a disease. Number 6. If this sounds like a conspiracy theory, that's exactly what they wanted you to think. Project MKUltra was one of the most disturbing government experiments in history. It started in the 1950s. The Cold War was heating up. The CIA wanted mind control. No, not hypnosis for fun. They wanted real, weaponized brainwashing. To create true serums, wipe memories, even program assassins. So they turned science into a tool of chaos. They dosed unsuspecting people with LSD, for days at a time. Some were locked in rooms. Others strapped to beds, injected repeatedly. They experimented on prisoners, soldiers, college students, psychiatric patients, random civilians at cafes and brothels. And they didn't just use drugs. They used sensory deprivation, electroshock, sleep deprivation, hypnosis, forced isolation. In one case, a man named Frank Olson, a CIA biochemist, was secretly dosed. He began hallucinating. 8 days later, he jumped out of a hotel window. His family believes he was pushed. The CIA said it was an accident. Then they said it was suicide. Then they admitted they drugged him. But by then, he was in a coffin. Thousands of MKUltra documents were destroyed in 1973. But the fragments that survived reveal a sickening truth. The government didn't just study people. They broke them. And most of the victims never even knew they were in an experiment. Number 5. It wasn't a nickname. That's what they actually called it. In the 1970s, psychologist Harry Harlow wanted to understand depression. So he created a device called the Pit of Despair. It was a steel box. No light, no sound, no warmth, just isolation. Inside it, baby monkeys. Newborns were taken from their mothers and placed in the pit, alone, abandoned, forgotten. Within days, they stopped moving. They didn't eat. They didn't make a sound. They just curled up in corners. Some rocked back and forth. Some clawed at themselves. Some died. Others survived, but came out broken. They couldn't mate. They couldn't interact. They didn't care if they lived or died. And when Harlow introduced them to normal monkeys, the damage was permanent. One monkey refused all contact. Another gouged out his own eye. This wasn't just unethical. This was psychological mutilation. The experiment proved something we already suspected. Love isn't optional. It's structural. Without it, the mind collapses in on itself. And in that cold steel box, the only thing that grew was despair. Number 4. It sounds like fiction, but it happened for 40 years. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began a study on the effects of untreated syphilis. They recruited 600 black men in Alabama, told them they were getting free healthcare, told them they were being treated. That was a lie. 399 of them had syphilis. And the doctors had no intention of curing them. Even after penicillin became the official treatment, they were denied access. No antibiotics, no truth. Instead, the government tracked the disease as it progressed. As men went blind, lost their minds, died. Some infected their wives. Some gave birth to children with congenital syphilis. Generations were damaged. The doctors didn't just observe suffering. They cultivated it. One researcher wrote that the men were valuable biological material. Let that sink in. This wasn't Nazi Germany. This was America. And the study didn't end until 1972, only after a whistleblower exposed it to the press. By then, hundreds had died. And trust in medicine, especially in black communities, had been shattered. This wasn't a study. It was a slow-motion execution, and the victims never knew what hit them. Number 3. You've probably heard the urban legend. The Russian sleep experiment creepypasta. But the real story? Almost as horrifying. In the 1940s and 50s, Soviet scientists explored the effects of prolonged sleep deprivation, using stimulant gas, dark rooms, and psychological torture. Subjects were locked in sealed chambers, kept awake for 10+ days, denied all forms of comfort, constantly monitored through two-way mirrors. At first, they became paranoid, then erratic, then violent. One tore out his fingernails, another ripped chunks of flesh from his body, while smiling. Eventually, they stopped speaking, stopped responding, then started screaming, non-stop, for hours, 4 days, and then silence. When guards finally opened the chamber, the walls were smeared with blood. One subject was dead. The others begged to be kept awake. That part may be legend, but here's what's real. The Soviets did experiment with sleep loss. They used soldiers, prisoners, orphans. They studied REM interruption, memory collapse, hallucination stages. One subject, after 6 days awake, suffered a brain hemorrhage while singing a folk song. Another became permanently catatonic, staring at a wall for 10 years. Sleep isn't a luxury. It's a biological repair system. Remove it, and the body decays. The mind unravels. And the soul, whatever's left of it, floats away. Number 2. You've heard of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, fallout zones. But what if I told you the US government tested radiation on its own people? Between the 1940s and 70s, a series of top-secret experiments were launched under the name of national security. And here's what they did. Injected plutonium into hospital patients without consent. Fed radioactive oatmeal to children in state-run schools. Released toxic gas over entire cities to monitor dispersal. Sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide on low-income neighborhoods, mostly black and Latino. In one experiment, a man with terminal cancer was told he'd be receiving pain treatment. Instead, they gave him uranium. In another, 73 disabled children in Massachusetts were fed radioactive iron, as part of a nutrition study. Many of these people died slowly, painfully, without ever knowing why. The government kept it secret for decades. When it finally came out, officials claimed it was for the greater good. Translation? You were expendable. They saw people not as citizens, but as canaries in a nuclear coal mine. And if some of them glowed in the dark on the way out, that was just data. Number 1. You've heard of Pavlov's dogs, but have you met baby Albert? In 1920, psychologist John B. Watson wanted to test if fear could be conditioned, so he found a 9-month-old baby, known only as Albert. At first, Watson introduced him to soft, fluffy animals, a rabbit, a dog, a white rat. Albert was delighted. He reached for them, laughed, showed no fear. Then came the twist. Every time Albert touched the white rat, Watson struck a steel bar behind his head. Bang! Albert screamed. Again, rat, bang, cry, rat, bang, terror. Within days, Albert began crying at the mere sight of the rat, then the rabbit, then a dog, then even Watson's white hair. Fear had been implanted, not by trauma, not by pain, but by association. Watson had just proven emotional programming was real. But here's the sickening part. Albert was never deconditioned. They never tried to undo it, they just let him go. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to him. Some say he died of illness at age 6. Others believe he lived unaware, carrying phobias that were deliberately engineered. Albert wasn't just a child. He was the first test subject in human emotional manipulation. The first child whose terror was turned into data. And no one even bothered to write down his full name. That's all for today. If you made it this far, you're not just curious, you're brave. Because this wasn't just history. It was a mirror. These experiments weren't sci-fi. They were real, approved, funded, and in some cases, applauded. The terrifying part? Many of them only stopped because they were exposed. Not because anyone suddenly grew a conscience. So if this disturbed you, it should. And there's more where this came from. Subscribe for more unfiltered truths. Because reality is darker than fiction. And sometimes, the monsters wear badges and lab coats.